Start. Okay, thanks, Heather. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we continue, after a bit of a break, the ACES webinar series on accessibility. I'm Tanya Lee Martin, Associate Director for Communications with the University of California Integrated Pest Management Program, and I'm also co-chair of the Diversity and Accessibility Learning Community here at ACE. As an ecstatic ACE member, if you're not currently one, please consider joining, especially if you enjoy events like this. And I do want to thank the ACE community for funding this webinar series with a professional development grant. And we also want to thank past and future ACE presenters for sharing their expertise and helping all of us learn a bit more about accessibility. And with that, I will introduce today's presenters. I'm very excited to introduce my colleagues, Cheryl Reynolds, Stephanie Pereira-Zweier, and Peter Casina. So Cheryl Reynolds, she, her, is a writer-editor for the University of California Statewide Integrated Pest Management Program, or UCIPM. In the last 12 years, she has designed and developed interactive online courses for pest management professionals, K through 12 school staff, and home residents. She has worked with several authoring software products, as well as video and audio editing programs. Stephanie Pereira-Zweier is a writer-editor with UCIPM. Stephanie develops educational and accessible resources such as online courses, videos, and written materials for agricultural audiences. Stephanie pays strong attention to accessibility in her work and continuously finds ways to ensure and improve the accessibility of UCIPM communication and educational products, which we are very thankful for. Peter Casina, he, him, is a content development supervisor at UCIPM. He studied horticulture and plant physiology, as well as vocational education and instructional design. With more than 2 decades of experience in ag extension projects in the Americas, Africa, and South Asia, Peter designed and developed many interactive and engaging online and in-person courses for ag professionals. And before I hand this off, a bit of housekeeping. Please put any questions you have in chat, and the non-speakers will be answering some of those questions. And there will be time at the end for, I believe, choose your own adventure style question and answer or discussion. So with that, Stephanie, please go ahead and start off the presentation, Accessibility Unleashed, Online Courses and Webinars.
Okay, thank you so much, Tanya Lee. I hope everybody can see this okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us here. We have a lot of information to cover today, and we're very excited to share what we know with you. So I'm going to start off today by talking about why we should think about accessibility in everything we do. Obviously, we do accessibility partially to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it's also important to remember that, compliance aside, making our products accessible benefits everyone, regardless of whether or not they are disabled. So making a course accessible can improve the way we communicate our information, help our learners digest and retain information more easily, and help accommodate people with different learning styles. So for example, if someone learns more through reading and less through hearing, then they might benefit from closed captions even if they're not hearing impaired. So even though accessibility is something we have to do to comply with disability laws, it's helpful for all of our learners. And at the same time, while everyone does benefit from accessibility, it's especially important because so many aspects of our society are much less accessible to people with disabilities. And that includes information, services, job opportunities, and even physical spaces where we simply exist. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is intended to ensure that people with disabilities have the same access to our institutions as any able-bodied person. It's also important to remember that disabilities are not a rare thing. They're incredibly common. The CDC actually estimates that more than 1/4 of the US population has at least one disability. So we miss out on a huge audience when our resources are not accessible. Disability is also not limited to any one thing. It's incredibly diverse. So when we're thinking about accessibility, it's important that we try to account for the range of disabilities that exist as much as we can. It might be easy for us to remember that we need to accommodate hearing impairment by adding closed captions, and it might be easy to remember that vision impaired people need our content to be compatible with screen readers in order to use our courses. And at the same time, the number of disabilities we need to consider in our work is much wider in scope than just those 2 examples. So other disabilities we need to keep in mind include fine motor disabilities, low vision that doesn't necessarily require a screen reader, color blindness, contrast sensitivity, dyslexia, epilepsy, and even anxiety disorders. So this isn't even close to being an all-encompassing list, but these are all disabilities that require our attention when we're developing online courses and other content. And they won't necessarily be addressed just by adding captions or just by making content screen reader compatible. In our courses, we also strive for cognitive accessibility, which essentially means we aim to avoid producing cognitive and sensory overload in our learning material. In the digital information-heavy world that we live in right now, cognitive overload and sensory overload can happen to anyone, and it makes it harder to focus on learning any one topic. But it's also especially critical to avoid these things for learners who have ADHD, anxiety, autism, and other disabilities that we might not normally think of when we're creating our content. And as someone who has a cognitive disability myself, I have felt the effects of that firsthand. So to reduce the potential for cognitive overload, we try to keep a simple course design that doesn't have too much on the screen at once. We make sure our users can play and pause as they wish, including each time they get to a new screen, so there's no autoplay that rushes them through. And then if we use music in the content, we make sure we're not blasting it over the narration that we're including, or and we make sure that the music's not being played in a way that's distracting or otherwise overwhelming to the audience. So that's just a few examples. So with these examples in mind, I'm going to pass this over to Peter for a brief overview on accessibility compliance and how we go about our online course development process. Take it away, Peter.
So as Stephanie mentioned, one of the reasons we care about accessibility is because we have to. There are two laws that we should be aware of. One of them is often referred to as ADA, American Disability Act, which is a civil rights law that prohibits the discrimination of people with disabilities in all areas of life, including when using electronic and information technology. And the other law that we will refer to is Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is a federal law that requires federal agencies, but also any organization that receive funding from federal agencies, including our universities, to maintain and use information and communication technology that people with disabilities can use. And then other institution or organization that we will be mentioning is World Wide Web Consortium, also referred to as 3W, that created a Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, abbreviated WCAG. It's a standard set of guidelines that is part of ISO, International Standard Organization rules, to create accessible online content. The latest version of these guidelines was published in October 2023, and it's WCAG 2.2. Now the question is how to make online courses compliant with ADA and Section 508, and the simple answer is to follow to follow the guidelines of the WCAG. The WCAG standards are based on 13 guidelines that are organized under 4 principles. Content must be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And there is a lot about it that we will not dive into today. So instead, we will be sharing the link to the WCAG standards in the chat. And if you are interested to learn more about this robust document and all individual 13 guidelines and the principles, you can go more to the website. But what I will mention that for each guideline, there are clearly defined success criteria. These success criteria are defined on 3 levels. The basic level, A, is not anymore sufficient. So if you have to meet the ADA and 508 standards, you have to target the AA level of success criteria that's required. And then there is also clearly defined criteria that would be a AAA level. Important to mention that that's not always possible to achieve with the diversity of online content that is part of online courses. However, we should all be striving wherever possible to go for the AAA standard. Any web content must satisfy selected level success criteria, or we have to provide conforming alternative. Now let's move to the components of online course accessibility. If you have developed online course or if you participate in any online course, you know that it's usually comprised of several modules. There can be videos, there can be different files included, and that form a course. In order to make the course accessible, all of its components must be accessible as well. And then the online courses are usually hosted within a learning management system, which is a standardized platform that allows administration of the online courses. And not surprisingly, the learning management system must also meet all the accessibility criteria as individual courses hosted within it. And to make it even more complicated, some learning management systems have so-called plugins. That's a piece of software that adds new features or extends functionality of the learning management systems, like proctoring of online courses, when you have to make sure that the people who take the courses are actually the people whom they claim to be. So these plugins must meet all the accessibility criteria as well. In a summary, the accessibility of online course depends on accessibility of all online course
Yeah, I
modules,
forgot about it. Okay, I'll call you back.
their components, and other linked content that includes even PDF files, linked videos that may be hosted on YouTube or podcasts, as well as the accessibility of the learning management system and its components. At UC-IPM, we host our courses on e-extension campus platform because UC-ANR, our mother organization, is a member of e-extension Foundation. So we have a free access to this learning management system platform. Moodle is great for many things and has everything what it needs to have to be accessible. However, it needs to be set up in its instance. In Extension Foundation, this is managed centrally. We are not administrators. We are just teachers and managers of individual courses. So when we have any issue with some accessibility components within Moodle, we have to report it to the e-Extension Foundation and they have to take care of it. We cannot do it directly. So that makes it a little bit more cumbersome. For developing online courses in UC-IPM, we currently use Adobe Captivate. We have selected Adobe Captivate as our authoring software about 7 years ago, and at that time, Adobe Captivate was actually one of the most advanced from the accessibility perspective. So that was one of the reasons we opted for this software. When we are converting recorded presentations into online courses, we use a so-called HTML5 package that's abbreviated as H5P, and that also enables all basic accessibility requirements. So now about what's our process for online course development. In our process, we base it on Dick and Carey model of systematic design of instruction. If you don't know much about this instructional design approach, we will share a link in the chat. Why I'm sharing this? Because we keep accessibility in mind as we go through each step of this process, instead of addressing it at the end. In this way, we have more time and flexibility to come up with solutions if there is any accessibility issue as we are developing individual components of the course, instead of leaving it at the end and being stressed, because making components accessible takes time. And so discover earlier that something may need to be done a different way is very useful. And it also makes the entire course more coherent for everybody who is taking the course. And so we will use this model for the rest of the webinar today. And to start, we will talk about developing good and accessible test questions. I will pass now the microphone to Cheryl.
All right, thanks, Peter. All right, so I'm going to be talking about tests and quizzes. All right, so in our course development process, we're building our test questions right after we're creating learning objectives. So to start, we develop a large bank of questions, and we make sure that we have at least 1 or 2 questions that we've written for each objective. And so from the very beginning, when we're developing test questions, we're considering accessibility. We recognize that every learner learns at a different pace and they process information differently. So we keep this in mind as we're creating. Oops. I lost my share, I think.
It was my mistake. Sorry, Cheryl.
That's okay. All right. All right. I think I'm back. Okay. So some of the best practices that we follow, move that alone. Okay. So when we create test questions, we've kind of come up with a list of best practices. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that we're providing succinct, clear instructions. We don't want to make the test questions too long, too confusing. So we do avoid things saying like, which one of these are not? So we try to make it very clear from the start. And then we also want to avoid confusing answer choices. So a lot of questions, you might see on a test, they might say, okay, all of the above or none of the above or A and C. We try to avoid those and just have strict basic answer choices. And then also, when we incorporate our test questions into our courses, we don't give a time limit. And we know that some people are taking longer than others, maybe to read and comprehend question and answer choices. And other people might have test anxiety. So we don't want to be stressing them out and giving them a time limit. So we're mindful of different ways that people might process information. So we give them all the time that they need. All right, so now I'm going to ask you all a question, and you can just answer in chat. So here's an example of a question with answer choices. So based on what I just said with our best practices, would this be considered a good question with good answer choices? And it is, which of the following rodenticides cannot be used for vole control in agricultural fields? And the answer choices are strychnine, zinc phosphide, anticoagulants, both A and C, and none of the above can legally be used to manage voles. All right, so I do see a couple answers in the chat. So no, no, it's confusing. It's not a good question. Okay, so that's right. So we don't want to have too many things saying which cannot, because if you have something that's cannot, and then you're answering both A and C or E, it gets confusing to try to figure out what we're even asking them to decide. Okay, so for accessibility, there are certain types of questions that are available in authoring programs or learning management systems, but only a few are truly accessible. One of the best types of questions is multiple choice, and multiple choice can either mean there's one correct answer, which is kind of indicated by circular, or they call them radio buttons, where you just answer one. Or it could be more than one answer, which is usually indicated by square buttons on the side. And so if somebody is visually impaired, a screen reader would read these questions and the answer choices. And also, if somebody had mobility issues and they can't use a mouse to click on the correct answer, they can use the tab or the arrow keys to move along and select. One thing I want to point out also, if you're creating multiple choice questions with an image, you have to also describe what somebody might be seeing in the image in case somebody can't see that. And we're going to go ahead and talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. Okay, so another type of question that's good for accessibility issues are drop-down. And so drop-down, again, a screen reader would read the question and answer choices to the person, or if somebody has mobility issues, again, somebody can use the tab and arrow key to tab and select down the drop down and select the right choice. In the learning management system, Moodle, that we use, we have option of matching. And so the option of matching in that case is basically just an elaborated drop down example. So this is kind of what it would look like for us. The choices are on the right side. You don't have to drag the numbers over to the correct thing you're trying to match it to. Instead, it would just be a series of drop downs where, again, If somebody can't use the mouse, they have mobility issues, they can use the tab and arrow keys to select the correct answer. All right, another type of question is fill in the blank. And if you're creating a fill in the blank and you want to draw a line to indicate the blank, don't do that with a series of underscores. And that's how some people might create the line. But what happens is if you create a line with underscores, a screen reader, if you're using a screen reader, would read it as underscore, 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 and so on. And so it would be confusing. So instead, if you're creating a area for a blank to be, you would just write the word blank inside of brackets, and then the screen reader should read that as it's a blank. One type of question that we don't do in our online courses, we avoid drag and drop. And these are problematic for anybody who has mobility issues, because what is happening here is the user would have to click on something, like in this example, they would have to click on spider, and they would have to click on it, select it, and drag it to another part of the screen. And so for somebody with mobility issues, that would be very hard for them to grab it, to move it, and to drop it down. If you do choose to use drag and drop, you must provide a conforming alternative version of the same question. But in our case, we just kind of just leave it out because it's easier to leave it out. So as we write our questions, we choose some that are going into our course as knowledge checks, and then we use Captivate for that. And other test questions are used in our final test, and we create that in the learning management system, which is Moodle. And now on the screen, you can see that Captivate offers a variety of question types, and then so does Moodle. But I just want to point out that just because the software or learning management system allows for a type of question and you're able to put that in your course, it doesn't mean it's accessible. So we just want to be always mindful of what's truly accessible when we're creating questions. All right, so now I am going to pass this back over to Peter.
Okay, back to the scheme of how we develop the courses, and the next step is instructional strategy. So here is an example how we do instructional strategy. What it is, it practically means that we divide content into the small chunks and decide in what order the components of the course will be presented, as well as decide in what form the part of the course will be presented, as the short instructional video, as a text to be read, or as some interaction. And at this stage, we already discussed if we foresee any accessibility issues in those individual components, especially when it comes to any interactions and videos. If it's simple text, it's usually much easier. The next step in our process is writing the storyboard and script. When we are developing the storyboard, and especially when we are writing the script, we strive to write the narration in a way that it provides all important details and description of the context and what actually is happening on the screen. And in that way, we don't need to create an alternative audio narration for visually impaired learners later, or add it to the video as an extra layer, because it's part of the narration from the very beginning. And the next step then in our process is development of materials and interactions. I will focus on the interactions. In the software that we use in Captivate, the interactions are divided into two groups. In the first group are interactive components for navigation through the course and for tests and quizzes. As you include these objects in the course, it's very important to make sure that they are correctly labeled, so that screen reader correctly describes the function of the given interaction inserted into the course. The questions of selecting a color, contrast, and font type, as well as a font size, will be presented by Stephanie in the moment. It's a very important part of those interactive buttons, as you will see. The second group of interactions
Apologies, I thought you were passing it to me.
No problem. The second group of interactions are so-called interactive widgets. It is essential that any type of interactions can be executed only using the keyboards without depending on the trackpad or mouse, as Cheryl already explained. Also, the interactions in which the learner needs to see the screen and click on particular place, those are also not accessible. So these drag and drops, similar thing as Cheryl explained with the text questions, even any other interactions that are based on the drag and drop principle in the course, we don't use them. And the second one is a hotspot. We also don't use them. I know that there are universities that are currently working on how to make hotspot interactions accessible, but so far it's not offered in the software that I am aware of. If you decide to use any of these interactions because they are critical for developing skills of your learners, again, you have to think about providing a relevant alternative for people with visual disabilities. And now is the time to pass to Stephanie for the next step.
Okay, now I present the color and contrast. Thank you for your patience. Thank you, Peter. So we're going to talk about one of my favorite accessibility topics now, which is color and contrast. And then after contrast, we'll briefly touch on the accessibility of fonts. Okay, so having good color contrast makes content much easier to read for anyone who can see, but it's especially important for people who have color blindness, contrast sensitivity, and low vision. And a huge number of people have these disabilities. So about 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women experience some form of color blindness. And then 10% of adults older than 71 years old have some form of contrast sensitivity. And people with these disabilities may not use screen readers at all. So even if the course is compatible with a screen reader, the content will still not be accessible to them if the contrast is bad or if they can't see the colors on the screen. And as Peter and Cheryl have both mentioned in different ways, this is another form of accessibility that's important to think about from the start as you're developing your course. It can be a serious pain to build an entire course only to find out that you have to change all of the colors because they're not accessible. So check your colors and contrast early and check them frequently. It will save you a lot of time. I like to check my colors using the contrast checker tool with WebAIM or Web Accessibility in Mind. This website has a lot of resources on making online content accessible. So give them a visit when you get the chance. And we'll add the link to the contrast checker now as well. Thank you, Tanuli. Okay, and then to use the contrast checker, you need to enter the foreground color, which is the color of the text, and then the background color, which is the color behind the text. And if you know the RGB codes for your colors, you can just type them into the checker. But if you have no idea what your RGB codes are, and you have sight and the ability to use a mouse, you can use the eyedropper function right here to grab the color directly off of your product. And then the program will determine whether they meet the accessibility standards. So here I'm testing the title portion of our slide, which I'm included in the top right corner. I have white text, and then I have a dark blue background. And so I've entered these into the program using the eyedropper tool because I have sight and I can use a mouse. So when I input the colors, the color contrast ratio gets displayed underneath it. And then if I scroll down, it will also tell me whether this color combo passes or fails the contrast requirements at both the AA and AAA level. Now, as Peter mentioned, by law, we must meet the AA requirements at minimum. But if we want to go above and beyond, there's also the AAA standards, which are considered the highest level of accessibility. I like to pass contrast at the AAA standard just to make the course accessible to as many people as possible. And with color, that's pretty easy to do. So, oh, I missed something real quick. So when you're choosing colors, it's also important to remember that good contrast depends on the size of the text that you're using. Large text tends to pass at lower levels of contrast than normal or small text. So it's important to remember that. When I'm creating an online course or any other kind of visual content, I always use the normal text to decide whether my text meets the standard. And the reason I do that is because while the text that I'm adding might look large to me on my screen, many of our learners are going to be taking our courses on small devices like smartphones and tablets. And so the text may end up looking much smaller for them than it looks for me. And so I always check that at that level. And then I also always check contrast, even if I think it looks okay just by eyeballing it. Because just because I can read something does not necessarily mean that somebody else can. So with that, I have a poll question for you all, if that can be brought up. And the poll question is, can you read this? The options are yes, no, and sort of, but it's a challenge. And there's no right answers. Just let me know. And I think we'll close that momentarily. Okay, so a lot of you can see it. But for some people it's a challenge. So it might be surprising to some people to find out that this contrast does not pass the contrast requirements for normal size text. And not even for the AA standard. So for the large text, it does pass at the AA level, but at the AAA level, it doesn't. So all in all, this color combination is not good for an online course or any visual material for that matter. Okay, so now I want you to try using the Web AIM contrast checker to see if the contrast on this screen is accessible. And we're going to add the contrast checker link in the chat one more time. We're also going to add the foreground code and the background codes for the colors into the chat. So if you're not able to use the eyedropper function, you can just input the color codes into the tool. And then we'll bring up a poll to say, does this pass the AAA contrast requirements? Okay, how long do we want to leave the poll up?
We have 4 responses now.
Okay.
5.
The tool can take a little bit of time to use, so I don't want to rush people too much. But I think we have enough right now, so we can close it. So yes, this does pass the color combination, the color contrast requirements for at the AAA standard. So this one is much trickier because it technically passes all of the contrast requirements for AA and AAA. But this color combo is not actually accessible because it's not perceptible to people who have blue-yellow color blindness or tritanopia. I actually made the mistake of using this exact color combination in my master's thesis presentation, only to find out that someone in my audience couldn't see any of the text because they had that type of color blindness. So color blindness adds a layer of complication to color that's really important to pay attention to. Many of the color combinations that are incompatible with color blindness will get ruled out when you're using the contrast checker, but not every single one of them does. So red and green, red and black, and blue and yellow are all examples of color combinations that will still fail accessibility standards, even if you're using the contrast checker. So be very careful not to use those color combinations. There may also be other ones that you should pay attention to, but the main lesson here is to pay attention to color blindness when you're choosing your color palette. One last thing about color and contrast is that layering text on top of a photo makes it extra complicated, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So here we have white text laid over a photo, and that produces different contrast depending on what part of the text and photo you're looking at. Maybe we can see some parts of the sentence, but in other places, it's difficult or even impossible to read, even if you have no vision issues. But when we add a text box fill that meets the contrast requirement, it makes it much easier to read the text positioned on the photo. So long story short, you don't have to completely avoid using photos behind text in order to have accessible contrast. You just need to use a text box fill that meets the contrast requirements and you'll be fine. If you're using graphs or other visualized data in your course, remember that you should never use color as the sole means of communicating information to the audience. Some people can't see color at all. They can only see things in a grayscale. So, and that's called monochromatic color blindness. So make sure your graphs are clearly labeled and make sure you're not completely relying on color to convey your information. And then if you want to add visual variation to your graphics, you can do that by adding texture or other patterns that don't only rely on color. So here's a good example of what not to do and what you could do instead. In the chart on the left, not only do these colors not pass the contrast requirements, but someone who has monochromatic color blindness would not even be able to tell which category is what because the labels are completely separate from the chart. Whereas in the chart on the right, we present the information with clear contrast on a grayscale, and our categories are clearly labeled. So that's all for color and contrast. Now I just want to briefly cover fonts because even though they're fairly simple, they're also very important. Readable fonts are important to anyone who can see, but they're especially important for people who have dyslexia, low vision, and learning and cognitive disabilities. So make sure you use a sans serif font. Serifs make it harder for people with dyslexia to distinguish letters. Times New Roman can sometimes be an exception to that, but I tend not to use that one either, just to be on the safe side. Formatting that uses underlining and italics also makes it harder for dyslexic people to read your content. So try not to use those if you can help it. And make sure the letter and the line spacing doesn't squish the text or end up putting too much space between the letters. I know it can be tempting to dress up your fonts to make the content more exciting or make it stand out, but when you do that, there's a really big risk of your content becoming less accessible. So no fancy fonts. And then here we have some examples of text that's not accessible, and then some text that's more accessible. So on the left, we have not only does this text have terrible contrast, but it's also an inaccessible font type, and it's using italics that makes it extra difficult for people who have dyslexia to read it. And then in the middle, we have text that maybe we can read, but it's squished together. It has underlining, and it's using a font type that is serif font, so dyslexic people would have a harder time reading that. And then the text on the right, however, is much easier to read because it's a sans serif font, it's reasonably spaced, and it doesn't have any problematic formatting. So that's all for fonts, and now I'm going to pass it to Cheryl to talk about making visuals accessible.
All right. So part of our design process is to improve the accessibility of images and videos for visually impaired people. So for things like photos, let me make sure that moves. Okay, so for photos and illustrations, charts and graphs, videos, other graphics such as buttons, we add descriptions to each of those elements. And this is called alternative text, and you might have heard it as alt text for short. And we add this as we add each of these elements into our course. So if you're visually impaired and use a screen reader, the screen reader reads the alternative text or all the descriptions, and it reads those for you so that you know what's being displayed on the screen. And if you don't provide a description, then the screen reader just skips right over it. So here is what could be an example of maybe what you would see on two different screens with buttons. So I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for a second and just kind of imagine that you're visually impaired and that you're listening to a screen reader read these two examples. So I'm going to push play now and imagine this is a screen reader.
Example 1. Text, insects, button, click here. Text, diseases, button, click here. Text, vertebrates, button, click here. Example 2. Button, insects. Select to proceed to screen on insects. Button, diseases. Select to proceed to screen on diseases. Button, vertebrates. Select to proceed to screen on vertebrate pests.
Okay, so just quickly in the chat, if you were visually impaired and you couldn't see the screens, which one of these would have been more useful for you. All right, so everybody is saying number 2, and that's right, because if you're visually impaired, you want the screen reader to describe what somebody's actually seeing. And the second example was describing the function of the button. We avoid using words such as click here because people with mobility issues, for instance, they might not be able to use a mouse and click. But also if they're visually impaired, they can't see what they're where they're clicking. So to have a screen reader read what's on the screen and explain where they would be going if they're clicking, that's more helpful. So when we do create alternative text, we do follow some best practices. And so the first thing is that it should describe the basic content of the image. It doesn't need to describe every detail. It just needs to give the basic content of what somebody is seeing. It should provide information on why the image is there and what the learner should get out of that image in context of what you're teaching. We use full sentences when we write alternative text. We don't want to use just fragments or partial sentences because a screen reader is reading it and we do want it to make sense. We do try to keep the description brief though. We don't want it to go on and on and on, so that could be a little overwhelming as well if somebody's relying on that screen reader to describe an image. One thing to avoid is to avoid the words like image or picture in your description, because what a screen reader would do is it's first going to describe the element. So it might say image. So it might say image and then what the image is. So we wouldn't want to be redundant and say image of whatever it is. So we avoid using those words in the actual description. And then for elements of such as buttons, as you saw in the previous example, we don't describe things such as shape and color of the button, but we rather just describe the function and where it would lead, where it's going to take the user. Now, if you have an image that has text, and I think somebody actually mentioned this in the chat, so here's an answer to that question, that if you have text in an image, you do need to include that text in your description as well. So for this example on the screen, there is a pesticide sign saying danger and do not enter, and that's sitting in front of a field of lettuce that's probably just been treated. And so you would include in the alternative text that there is a sign, and you would include that the words danger, do not enter, and you can also include the Spanish on there as well. For images such as graphs and charts, you might not necessarily need to describe every single data point, but rather just kind of describe trends and patterns if that's what's truly important. So you might not need to know, for example, in 2003 that 40,000 pounds of bifenthrin was detected, but maybe you just need to know what the overall trend is. And of course, maybe if something like that is important, you would include it in the alternative text. So it's whatever you're trying to get across to your learner. So there are some elements that don't need alternative text. And these are things such as banners, photos that maybe are just there on the screen to make it look pretty, but they're not providing any information related to the content, or something like an icon, just anything that's not helping you in your context of what you're teaching, they can be skipped over. All right, so here is an image that we used in one of our recent online courses that we just put together. And some text that went along with this image is, and I'll read this to you, it's application to soft surfaces can be made, but not within 2 feet of horizontal impervious surfaces, meaning broadcast sprays must stay at least 2 feet away from concrete and other hard surfaces. So if you were going to create alternative text for this image, which would you use? So I'm going to bring up, somebody's going to bring up a poll. And so which of the following elements are important to include in the alt text for this image? And the choices would be a person spraying, color of the house, concrete sidewalk and driveway, lawn, car parked on the side, and the 2-foot border.
Cheryl, we will have to use the chat. I'm not able to launch that poll and I have no idea why.
Okay. I can see if I can run it on,
Okay, cool.
I think, well,
I am seeing my second poll.
yeah,
Oh, there we go.
yeah, I think is it up? I think it's up now,
It's up
right?
now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think there's a few people. Okay. All right, I think we can go ahead and end the poll. I think we have a lot of people who've responded. Okay, so the alternative text, like I said before, it doesn't need to describe everything in the image. So none of you selected the color of the house and the car parked on the side. And that is good because those things are not important to what we're teaching. So the person spraying, the concrete sidewalk and driveway, the lawn, those are all important things. One of the things we don't need to necessarily include in here, though, is the 2-foot border, because although it's in the text and it's on the screen of the course where it's describing how to spray, it's not actually in this image. So it's not actually, if somebody were just describing this image to you, there's nothing about a 2-foot border in this image. That doesn't have to be part of the alternative text. So it would be part of the text on the screen and maybe a caption, but it doesn't have to be part of the description that is part of the alternative text. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the poll. See if I can move it out of the way. Okay. And so, what could be in this alternative text could be something like, person spraying pesticide in the middle of a home lawn surrounded by concrete sidewalk and driveway in an urban neighborhood. Okay, so one thing to point out is alternative text does take a long time to write. So it's important when you're planning out a timeline for creating an online course or anything online, just to kind of add that time into your timeline, because it does create a little bit extra time to create descriptions for every image that you use in a course. So now I'm going to switch to video clips. So if you're working with video clips and somebody can't see the video, you can leave space for audio description between pieces of dialogue. For one of our online courses, we had a cartoon animation and we gave 2 options, and I'm going to play the first option. The first was the video, and it had the option of closed captions for their narration. So I'm going to play this part now.
Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Ann.
With this hot weather, trap counts are high again this week. We should try to get your next spray on as soon as safely possible. The sooner, the better.
Hey, Silvano. We need to change our plan and get into Block B as soon as possible with the next spray. Have Hector start there this afternoon.
Okay, but we'll need to finish Block A first. I'll let him know you want that done.
Okay, so that was the first option with the closed captions. And now this second option is for people who were visually impaired. And so we provided them with this enhanced version of an audio file, and it has a little extra description of what was happening between the pieces of dialogue. So I'll let you listen to this part.
Early in the morning on the citrus farm, grower Joe works on his tractor when PCA Ann walks into the scene from her pickup truck.
Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Ann.
With this hot weather, trap counts are high again this week. We should try to get your next spray on as soon as safely possible. The sooner, the better.
Later the same morning, grower Joe talks on the phone to foreman Silvano, who is in the farm workshop.
Hey, Silvano. We need to change our plan and get into Block B as soon as possible with the next spray. Have Hector start there this afternoon.
Okay, but we'll need to finish block A first. I'll let him know you want that done.
Okay, so that is how we handled just to have an extra version of audio for people who were not able to see. Okay, so I'm gonna switch really quickly now to closed captions. Captions are for those who have some type of hearing loss, but also for those who may not be able to understand maybe the accent of somebody who's speaking. If you're in a room with too much noise, you might need to turn on captions, and it just can help a person focus on what's being said. There are open and closed captions. Open captions are for those, if you've seen a video where captions are burned into the screen and you don't have the option to turn them on and off, that's open captions. We deal with closed captions where they can be turned on and off by the learner. So when we're designing our courses, we design with captions in mind. So for the latest version of Captivate that we were using, we had the option of leaving the bottom portion of our screen blank, and we could choose the color, the font, the position of the captions. Now, some software programs, you can import a file and it'll do the timing for you. The version of Captivate we were using, we had to type it in by hand, time it with the narration, make sure that the captions were remaining on the screen so that people had time to read them. We're going to be switching to the new latest edition of Captivate, which is a more responsive design. So we'll be relearning how to use captions in that new version. But just some best practices that we've learned as we're creating closed captions, just to make sure that spelling and punctuation is correct. A lot of times if you are importing an automatically generated transcript into your course, sometimes the spelling and punctuation is not 100% correct. So double check that for accuracy. If we have a speaker, if there's music or coughing or laughing or times with no audio, we put those things into brackets. So just to kind of separate it from what's actually being said. In terms of numbers and symbols, so for numbers, we write the number, we don't spell it out. For things such as percent, we use the symbol, we don't spell out the word percent. If there's a pause in the audio, we use the 3 dots ellipsis to indicate that. Also, we would use an M dash if a speaker got cut off and you couldn't make out the rest of their audio, what they were saying. There are lots of tips and best practices. And so I have a URL here at the bottom, and I think we're going to add that to the chat. And so you can check that out for more best practices on captions. But for now, I'm going to turn this back over to Stephanie.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I know we're getting kind of short on time, but we're just going to touch really briefly on reading order and keyboard navigation, because these are very important in terms of screen reader compatibility and people with fine motor disabilities. Reading order helps make sure that the people who rely on screen readers will be able to hear the content in a way that you wish to present it. If you forget to check the reading order of your content, it can make the course really confusing for anyone who's visually impaired and using a screen reader. So depending on what software you're using, reading order might be kind of difficult to do, but many programs are making it easier to incorporate into your work. So it's a pretty simple concept overall. Just make sure that the reading order is arranged in a logical way. So for this slide, for example, we would want the title to be read first. We would want the bullet points to be read second, the alternative text for the image to be read third, and then the photo credit to be read last. And then I wouldn't want the logo to be read because hearing that over and over again on every screen would get really annoying for anyone who is using a screen reader. I also want to point out that having a bad reading order combined with other accessibility problems can render a course completely unmanageable for people using screen readers. So for instance, if we take Cheryl's example of the buttons that had the bad alternative text, it's hard enough to listen to text insects button, click here, text diseases button, click here, etc. But then if you were to do that and then not check your reading order either, it would come out something like text diseases, text insects, text vertebrates, button, click here, button, click here, button, click here. And so you'd end up with a course that just really does not make sense to someone who's using a screen reader. Similarly, we also want to check the keyboard navigation order and make sure that when people with mobility issues are using the course, they can navigate the interactive content in the order that you mean them to. So you can check and fix the keyboard navigation by checking the tab order in your course authoring software and then rearrange it as necessary. And make sure you also test it before you publish just to confirm that it's working as planned. You can do that by going through the entire course using only a keyboard, not with a mouse. Okay, so with that, I'll pass this to Peter real quick and then we'll close out.
So this is actually our last slide about online course accessibility, and that's about testing. So the beta version, when we release that to our testing group, it's when the rubber hits the road, so to speak. We always have to plan sufficient time for testing and do it on as many devices and browsers as possible to discover all possible issues. At UC IPM, we are lucky to have volunteers from our target audience. These are pest management professionals who regularly take our courses, and they are helping us to test courses on their devices and their browsers and providing feedback on standardized form that we have. If possible, it's ideal to have people with disabilities in the test group, but it's not easy to find them. But if you can, definitely go for it. So this is all for accessibility of online courses that we had ready, and we have extra slides for accessibility in webinars, but I guess given the time, we will leave that for another webinar and hopefully don't disappoint you too much. But we are ready to stay here for a few more minutes and respond to any questions or have any discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, Cheryl, and Peter, for sharing how you've been making accessible online courses. And we only have a minute for additional questions. So if you have to go, we understand that, but please fill out the webinar evaluation form before you go. And if you can stay on for a few minutes, let us know what questions you have for our speakers. You can raise your hand if you'll unmute or continue to put your questions in chat.
And I think we actually have a couple questions in the chat.
I can check. So Joan, you had a question about drag and drop and then also about text in photos. Did your questions get answered?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, I still have a lot of questions about using images and text together because according to people like Myers and Clark, multimedia learning theory, that is one of the most effective ways for people to learn something, is if the text is close to the place on the image that you want them to pay attention to. So how do you balance that, which would affect a lot more users and learners, I would think, than people using screen readers? How do you balance that with needs of accessibility? Those are the kind of things I'm always trying to figure out.
One way how we address it, until now, we were using non-responsive design of online courses. What it means is the way how we did them in Captivate, when people watch them on different size of the screens, it didn't reshuffle the content. It was always the same size. And we used a lot of form of lecture style. So there would be a voice narration over text and image on the screen that are timed. And that goes back to what I mentioned, that we are really careful writing the script and practically describing everything what's going on the screen in the script, including the images, trends, whatever needs to be pointed, description of the graph. Now with the new way of Captivate, which is more similar also to Articulate and 365, We will be using responsive design, and we will have to learn what the options in this new way of designing the courses we will have.
I don't think there's necessarily an answer to that question. More of a rhetorical question.
Jim, are you waving goodbye or do you have a question? I have a question, Stephanie, about font size. I noticed in the web AIM, they talk about small, large font size, and that could lead to differences in color contrast. So how do I know if my font size is large? Are there sort of general guidelines around that? I know we mentioned in mobile, right? It'll be different. Presentation, it'll be different.
Goodness, that is actually a really important point that I completely forgot to look up. I would say normal text is probably like font size 12, just because it's for written resources. I imagine that larger font, I actually don't know, so I probably shouldn't speak on which one it is. But I can try and look that up and send that out to people if that would be helpful. Does that work? Okay, thank you. I think that's a very good question.
So I think it's really more relevant to the printed content, where you don't depend on the size of the screen that you use to see the content, right? With the screen sizes, it's all relative, because what may look small in the big screen will be big enough, and vice versa.
Yeah, so that's why I always use the normal text one. If it's large to me, I still use the normal one. So I don't put that much attention into what font size am I using, because it could still end up being small for people taking the course. So
that makes sense to be more conservative.
yeah.
There's a question from Jan in the chat about determining time length for a course for continuing education unit application purposes. And it says, do you base this on the alt text? So I think maybe the length of the course. Does it also include the alt text, I think, reading and the narration?
Cheryl is our expert.
I would say the determining the length of the course would be based on the time of narration, or if it's, a text-based course, it would just be based on how much time it takes somebody to read through the text. I don't think if we were submitting it to like the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, to evaluate, they're not going to evaluate the alternative text. I think they would just evaluate the narration time or the number of words or something on the screen, how long it takes somebody to read through those. I don't think they would take that into consideration.
And it's very tricky. In the past, they were requiring that people spend certain amount of time on the course. And so we had to divide it based on screens with the text and have a timer there. And even if people finished reading, they would still have to be waiting till the time reaches the time. That was against all the educational principles, but we had to do it to meet the CEU requirements. Now, the requirements have changed significantly since last year, but also the way how we are doing the courses is changing. So hopefully we will have a better solutions in the future and we will not need to use the timer.
Okay, so if there's no other questions, I don't see any questions in chat. Last chance, anyone? I do want to thank everyone for your questions and the kind words in chat. Thanking our speakers again. Thank you so much. Don't forget to fill out our webinar evaluation survey and have a good rest of your day, everyone. And thank you, Heather, for your help. Glad you're here.
Thank you, everybody.